Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please be sure to leave this video a like, and to subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am once again doing another quick review series. I know I said I was doing a bit of a soft relaunch of this series, but you should actually expect a couple more of them this summer as I continue to see more movies and listen to more music, along with my typical individual reviews that will be coming on the occasion. But today, we do have another episode of quick movie reviews this time around, since I just did a quick music review video a couple weeks ago. And yeah, we have 8 different movies on the docket. All 8 I am pretty interested to talk about in varying degrees. And as with the title and how it would imply, I'm going to try to keep my thoughts on these relatively brief so that this video doesn't go on too long. But if I have more to say on a particular movie, then I will say more on that movie. But let's not waste any more time and get started with the first movie on the docket I will be talking about. Alright, so the first 2 movies I'm going to be discussing are ones that are both fairly recent, including one that came out just last week, and that is the movie In a Violent Nature. I was very intrigued by this movie when I saw the trailers and found out about what the concept was. Basically, this movie is, in a lot of respects, your typical horror slasher movie, where you've got a very violent, seemingly inhuman slasher who kills without mercy, hunting after a group of unsuspecting teenagers on a camping trip. But this movie has one pretty unique thing going for it. It's not that this hasn't been done before, but it isn't done all the time, I will say, and that is that this movie is pretty much entirely from the perspective of the slasher themselves, rather than the characters getting killed. So that is something that I think a lot of horror fans really have been asking for, is a movie from the perspective of a killer. Now, I first want to get started off by talking about the positives of this movie. Now, one thing that's going to be hard to deny is that this movie really relies on one central gimmick, and that gimmick is the movie being from mostly the perspective of the killer. And I think it's hard to deny that is a gimmick, but I also don't say that gimmicks are always a bad thing. Sometimes they can work in a movie's favor. And I'd say there's many places in this movie where it does work in the movie's favor. In fact, I would say when the movie is focusing on the killer, it tends to be more interesting in a lot of places than when the movie's ending happens, which I'll get into in a second. But there are some problems still with the parts focused on the killer, which I'll also get into later on. But let's start with the positives right now. And one positive is I do think it is just really interesting to see things happening from the killer's perspective, especially because this killer has some intriguing traits about him that I sort of appreciate aren't ever fully revealed. Another big thing going for this movie, and I will say that this is the most significant positive of it for sure, is the kills themselves. Man, there are some pretty good kills in here, including one that might be one of the all-time best I've seen in any horror movie to date. It is so gruesomely creative is the best way I could describe it. I don't know how the director thought of this kill, Chris Nash, because it is one of the most wild things I've seen in a horror movie. I could see a lot of people turning away from it and being disgusted by it because it is just that brutal. It really crosses the line in many ways, but it is also just a really good kill. I can't deny it. It really works in what it's doing, and the fact that there's no music, score, no nothing, just the sounds of what he's doing to this poor victim, that makes it, I think, even more impactful. It just makes it more haunting. That unfortunately this kill is so good that the rest of the kills don't really work as well in comparison, but there is still that tension going on of it being so up close and personal, and just seeing the killer's utter lack of reaction after committing these heinous acts only makes it a little more haunting, in my opinion. He just does these very brutal kills, and then he just sort of leaves and walks without any real reaction, enjoyment, or terror at what he's done. There's nothing there, just blank expression, mainly exacerbated by the mask that he wears, and then he just walks on and gets ready to do the next kill as if just an animal on the hunt. I will also say that I think the person playing the killer did a very good job with his physicality and body movements. Rye Barrett was quite good as Johnny the killer, And while we don't get to know him super well, and he doesn't have any dialogue at all, he is entirely silent throughout the movie, it still feels like there's some intriguing things going on with him, and I think that's just because of how well Rye Barrett plays him. You always feel there's something that could be lurking underneath the surface, and it's really interesting to have the desire to uncover that. And this is where we get, I guess, into a couple negatives of the movie. One of the biggest is that I think this movie has a lot of time where it pads out its runtime, maybe a little bit too much. There's a lot of points where we're just sort of watching the killer walking to his next kill, and I get it, we're watching from the killer's perspective, but I just feel like maybe there could have been some other interesting stuff going on in that dead space rather than just him walking to the next place. I guess the idea is that they're wanting this all to be happening literally in real time, all his kills to be happening in real time, and that is basically how the movie goes. At the same time, I don't really love the fact that there's just all this walking stuff that doesn't add anything to the story, it's just us watching this happen. And there are some scenes where it just goes on way too long. There's this one kill towards the end where they let it go on for a super long time, and it just gets a little underwhelming after a while. The horror starts to wear off a bit as you're just watching it happen. And also, I will say the ending of the movie is a little disappointing as we sort of let go of the rule of following the killer and we go into the final girl's perspective. And from there, it becomes what feels like a more conventional horror movie, except it unfortunately is a little bit boring as we see her just sort of driving off with this other woman, and they have this conversation that is admittedly pretty intriguing, but it is sort of disappointing that we don't ever go back to the killer's perspective again. We don't ever see him again after the end of the movie. I will also say that besides Rye Barrett, I don't think any of the performers in this are particularly good. There are a lot of cheesy lines in here, I think forcibly so, and unfortunately the actor's delivery doesn't really help them at all, and it also doesn't help that we don't really get to sympathize with any of the characters, which is why it's even more confusing that we go into the final girl's perspective at the end of the movie because we've been given no reason whatsoever to care about her, really. When you balance all the elements together, I think this is a decent movie with a cool idea at its center. There's just some places where I think it's sort of flawed in its execution. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Pretty interesting watch, but you may not like it. I think it's going to be a very polarizing one for sure. Another newer movie, and that is Furiosa, the prequel to Mad Max Fury Road. Now, admittedly, I was a little unsure of why exactly George Miller was deciding to do a prequel to Fury Road in particular, even though Fury Road is a superb movie, maybe one of the all-time best action movies ever, but it just seems like it came sort of out of nowhere because all of his other Mad Max movies, there hasn't really been a prequel to any of them, and this one would not have Mad Max in it at all, which was certainly an interesting choice. So I was very intrigued by this, and I didn't really have any doubts that George Miller would disappoint. He's a great director, and he's just more confident in his craft than he's ever been, and it's just impressive how he's been able to make these crazy action movies even as an 80-year-old. So what did we get out of Furiosa? Pleased to say I was not proved wrong at all. This is a great movie, and I think a very fitting prequel. I appreciate that it really does do a good job at connecting to Fury Road, and it gives you a little bit more of a story for Furiosa, and I think builds her into an even more interesting character than I do think she already was in Mad Max. I think this is just a really good story. You could call it a revenge story, and I think that is a big part of it as she's taking revenge on Dementis, who kills her mother from a very young age, and she is essentially forced into a life of slavery and trauma as a result of that. So it is a very slow burn, in many ways, story of her planning out her revenge and going after Dementis. But I do appreciate that the movie doesn't necessarily take the route you would expect it to for a revenge story template. First of all, man, I saw a lot of people being worried that visually this one wouldn't be as good because they didn't like the trailers, and I'll admit some of the trailers looked a little rough and not quite as good looking with the effects and stuff as Fury Road did. But the movie itself, I think it just works a lot better in context. This movie just looks great. It is shot beautifully. The desert scenes look excellent. What George Miller always excels in, at least what he excelled in is in Fury Road, were these really cool car chase sequences. And while I won't say there's any in this movie that match up to the absolute insanity that happened in Fury Road, I do still think there were some very exciting scenes in here. There's one in particular in the middle of the movie that really just got my heart pumping and just works so well. And still, generally, all the action scenes are just executed in an excellent way to where it doesn't feel like you're stressed out by not knowing what's going on. Also, I think most of the characters in here are pretty great. Although I think I like Charlize Theron a little better as Furiosa, I think Anya Taylor-Joy does a great job as Furiosa, and the younger Furiosa in here is great as well. In fact, it takes a while before we see Anya Taylor-Joy in this movie. We spend a lot of time with younger Furiosa, and the girl that plays her is excellent. Both of these actors don't have much dialogue to deal with. Anya Taylor-Joy, from what I've read, only has 40 lines of dialogue, and the girl might even have a little bit less. They just do not talk much at all, but their physical performances are just great. And then, honestly, the shining force of this might be Chris Hemsworth as Dementus. I mean, wow, what a great performance he puts on. You can tell he's having such a great time in this movie. His enthusiasm and how he plays this character is great. It's nice to see him playing a character again that's outside of the MCU, and he's really putting his all into this character, and he plays him so well. You can feel the menace exuding from this character, and you just feel his power. He does such a great job in this, and I love the way his character develops throughout the movie and just becomes more and more unhinged as the movie goes on. The problems that I have with this movie would be very few and far between, to be honest. I would say that maybe the movie overstays its welcome a little bit. By about chapter 4, I was starting to feel its length ever so slightly, but I also won't say that I was bored at any time. There were just some parts where it felt like maybe they could have gotten to the point a little quicker, or that they were reinforcing the same ideas again, but once again, it wasn't bad. And I will say that maybe some of the side performances that aren't Anya Taylor-Joy or Chris Hemsworth aren't as interesting as they could be. They're not bad by any means, but I just don't think that any performance necessarily stands out as much as our two leads. I just don't have that many issues with this movie, and I think the ending helped reinforce how much I really did like this movie. Ultimately, I really liked the ending. I liked that they didn't take the typical path that a revenge movie would take, and the way that Furiosa takes revenge is a way that would not make her character, I guess, as bad as Dementus, but it is still a very messed up way to take revenge, but at the same time still enforces the character arc that she goes on in a very, I think, satisfying way that I enjoyed a whole lot, and left me with a smile on my face, to be honest. Yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. I think it was a fitting prequel to Mad Max. I like that the very ending just connects right into Fury Road. Like, you could watch Fury Road right after it, and you wouldn't feel like you really skipped a beat. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Strong 4 out of 5 stars. This is going to be one of my favorite movies of the year for sure. Next up, let's talk about the movie Challengers, which is a very interesting movie that is both about tennis and not about tennis. It is also about the central relationship between these three characters, and you can never really predict who's on top at any point in the movie and who's winning. Well, with one exception, there might be one obvious winner in this, and that is Zendaya's character, Tashi. She is definitely the clear victor in this movie at almost any point in it in terms of how she plays, because not only does she know how to play the game of tennis very well, but she knows how to play the game of balancing her relationships very well. I really like Mike Faist as Art Donaldson. He is excellent in this, and I really think his arc might be the most interesting in the movie, as we see him starting out in the present as this sort of defeated tennis player who only seems to be in it because Tashi wants him to be, and Tashi is living her tennis dream through him because she can't play tennis anymore due to a life-altering injury she had when she was younger. So it's very interesting to see the sort of dynamics of that relationship playing out in the present and how it's affecting them. Josh O'Connor is great in this as Patrick Zweig. I've seen great potential in this guy ever since his excellent performance in The Crown, and he only continues to impress here. I just really like what he's bringing to the table. His character is in a lot of ways sort of despicable, but it's sort of fun to watch him be that way. I won't deny it. And then Zendaya's performance as Tashi is just excellent. She sort of excellently reflects the music score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross as this person who is just feeling like she's constantly at the end of her rope in this movie in terms of what she's trying to accomplish, whether it's through her desire to be a all-star tennis player that eventually gets dashed through tragic happenings in the movie, or her desire to live vicariously through Art Donaldson, but still proving that she is ultimately the master at tennis no matter what. But I think the driving force of this movie and what makes it work so well is how these three are sort of balancing their relationships with each other. Because there's some clear attraction going on all fronts, and it's very intriguing to watch. It's very fun to watch how it shifts and leaves you guessing throughout the movie, much like a tennis match would. I really do like that the relationship is sort of a reflection of the tennis match and how it can look like one person is ahead or in the lead at one point, but then another person will strike back and the tides will shift once again. And then sometimes there will be some equilibrium, much like in a tennis match. It's very cool to see how Luca Guadagnino just sort of balances all these different aspects of the movie and makes one that is very complex in how the relationships are portrayed and keeps it just constantly on the edge of your seat. And yeah, while we're at it, let's talk about that score from Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor, because it might be one of my favorites of theirs. I'm not sure if it's as good as The Social Network, but it comes pretty dang close. Then there's the tennis matches. Man, the tennis matches are so well done in this. And it's sort of funny because the director says he finds tennis to be a boring game, but he manages to make it the most exciting thing ever in this movie, and I just absolutely love how he portrays the matches with all the various camera angles and stuff. It just comes across as super interesting. I just pretty much love almost everything this movie has in it. I don't have many issues with it, to be honest. I think maybe the one thing might be that the time skips can be a little sporadic at times, but that also sort of makes sense with the frantic energy of the movie, so not the hugest deal in the world. And maybe there could have been a couple more scenes with tension between Art and Patrick. I feel like a lot of the tension comes from Tashi's interactions with the two characters rather than the two of them themselves, even though it seems like more of the tension would come from them two. But nevertheless, that's a very minor quip in my opinion, for me at least. I just love this movie. It's easily one of my favorite of the year. Next up, let's talk about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which is a very interesting sequel in that it pretty much, in many ways, entirely reboots the franchise in that we are doing a pretty important time skip to where we don't have any of the old characters from the previous Planet of the Apes movies that have been out, and instead have an entirely new cast of characters who are living in the sort of new world that Caesar helped create. And we get to see the ramifications of that, which can be very interesting. And man, it is so impressive how consistent these movies have been. I really enjoyed this movie. I really enjoyed how it is progressing the story of the Planet of the Apes forward, and while it might be taking it into maybe some familiar territory, I don't necessarily think that's a problem, at least for me. I really found the plot in this to be thoroughly intriguing, and how the apes and the humans are sort of finding their footing in this new world and the relationships that they have with one another, mainly that being of distrust. And yeah, I like all the new characters here as well. I think that Noah, our new main character, is excellent. I really like him as a main character. I think he's very likable. Planet of the Apes, this one does have a sort of grim tone to it, but I think it works very well, and it treads that line very well, and still manages to have some moments of levity that work well too, I think. Freya Allen is really good as May. I think it's interesting to see her as the main human of the movie, and I like that they keep her character semi-unpredictable in the movie, although you could see where some of her motivations were going. But I'm very interested to see what they're going to do with her in the next movie as well, because I could see them going one way or the other. I could see them making her more sympathetic, or I could see them taking her more of a villain route. And then there's a way that they use Caesar, or Caesar's philosophy rather, in this movie that is also very intriguing. Kevin Durand does a great job at playing Proximus Caesar, who is claiming to take the mantle of Caesar's values, but is ultimately perverting them. I love that the movie just has this very poignant irony in it, where they're using these electric staffs, these electric prods that were originally used on Caesar in the first movie, and as a way to dehumanize them, but now they're using them as weapons of power. It's just a really interesting irony that I think works well. And it leads into one of the movie's main themes, I think, of how charismatic leaders can sort of deceive people just by using philosophies that sound nice on the surface, but they're using them in a perverse way. I think it's a very well done theme that resonates throughout the whole movie and brings all the characters home in very powerful ways. And visually, I mean, man, this movie is once again stunning. The CGI on the apes is still mind-blowingly good. And the fact that they were able to use just a whole new cast and still do this well is undeniably impressive, I think, and just speaks to the strength of this franchise. They even brought in a new director for this, Wes Ball, and he really brings the movie home in an excellent way. Yeah, once again, I don't have that many issues with this movie. I do think it's another one where you could say maybe it overstays its welcome a little bit, maybe it runs a little too long, and there are some points where it's a little predictable. And like I did say, it is treading into some familiar territory for the Planet of the Apes franchise, but I think people who are fans of the older versions of the movies will probably be pleased with that more than turned off. But it is interesting what all this is coalescing to. I think this is a great introduction to this new world of Planet of the Apes that we're entering, and I'm very excited to see where we go next. This was a pretty great movie, and one that I enjoyed a lot. 4 out of 5 stars for this one. Alright, next up, let's talk about The Fall Guy, starring Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt. I did find this one to be enjoyable. I thought it was sort of cool to see a movie sort of recognizing the stuntmen of Hollywood, and how they are often a undervalued and under-recognized group. The movie even sort of acknowledges at one point that there's not an Oscar category for them, even though they probably should have one for all the impressive stunts that they do. So it's clear that this movie has something in mind with how much it reinforces that concept over and over. But this movie is also a pretty cool combination of a rom-com and an action movie, and I think it does generally well on both fronts. I will say that I think the action aspect maybe works a little better. I think there are some pretty fun action scenes in here. They're shot very well, and I mean, when you look at the credits, it's very impressive to see how much of the stunts, in fact, it seems like almost all of them were done naturally, and I like that, once again, they don't feel all that disjointed, and it feels very in the moment, and you aren't distracted by so many camera cuts. It all works quite well. I also think our two leads are pretty charming in here. Ryan Gosling is my favorite actor, personally, and I really liked him in this. It's fun to see him transitioning into roles that are maybe a little less serious, and let him show off a bit more of his comedic side, because I do think he is a very funny guy, and I think he's funny here, too. I think he has some great one-liners, and a lot of funny moments in this movie. Emily Blunt is great here, too. It was nice to see her portraying a character who was more funny as well. I think she does very well at comedy when she's given the chance, and I do think the two of them work off each other pretty well. I do feel like we don't have that many scenes in here to establish their chemistry, so there's a disappointing lack of them being together in the movie, which is why I do think the rom-com aspect of this movie doesn't work as well as I would want it to. There are definitely some points in this movie where the comedy can get a little awkward, in my opinion, especially with Aaron Taylor Johnson's character. Even though I really like Aaron Taylor Johnson as an actor, his character in this just doesn't really work for me that much. That also goes for Winston Duke's character, even though I also do like him as an actor. And I do think that, especially near the end of the movie, it was getting maybe a little repetitive in terms of what it was doing, but I still did find this to be a generally enjoyable ride. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for this one. Next up is the movie The Idea of You, and man, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I don't really get the positive critical hype for this one, besides the fact that Anne Hathaway is back in a movie, which is nice, I guess, but I just found this movie to be not very good at all. It read like a fan fiction more than anything, which is never good. Maybe just the whole concept of it was a little bit cringe to me, just this mom falling in love with a younger singer. Not saying that it couldn't happen, because I'm sure it has happened in many situations, but the way this movie writes it out, it just does feel like a fantasy scenario, and it never feels particularly realistic, nor does their relationship feel particularly realistic in this movie. It doesn't feel like this is how the relationship would go, in my opinion, and I just think the dialogue is really badly written for the most part. I really didn't care for either main character either, sadly, even though I really do like Anne Hathaway as an actress and think she is excellent in a lot of things. She was okay in this, but didn't do anything particularly impressive, and Nicholas Galitzine was not particularly great in this either. I found his character just be incredibly cheesy and over the top. There were a couple of cute moments in the movie, I guess, but overall I found the relationship to not be that great. The music in it wasn't that great either. It didn't feel like something, I don't know, it just didn't feel like something that would necessarily be a big hit in the US, the stuff that the boy band was making. Yeah, I found this movie to be very unengaging, and I just was waiting for it to be over. I just did not care for it at all. I found it to be just so cheesy and so utterly just asinine. 2 out of 5 stars for this one. Next up is Tarot, and I'll admit that while the trailers looked a little bit cheesy, I was hopeful that this one could be sort of like an Insidious-like horror movie where we had all these different creatures and creative creature designs that could come after the characters. But no, that's not really what we got. Instead, what we got was a horror movie template that you have seen time and time and time again, where characters go into or are hanging out at a mysterious area that is secluded, and they come in contact with an artifact that is clearly having some sort of curse on it that they shouldn't interact with, but lo and behold they do, and then what do you know, next thing they are encountering horrible things happening to them as a result of interacting with this horrific artifact. It's something you've seen time and time again. In fact, this movie feels so derivative of Insidious that it's not even funny, and it's just a far worse version of it. It is a D-tier version of it in many ways, and there are just so many issues with this movie, I don't know where to start. I will say that I still did like some of the creature designs for the tarot cards. I particularly found the Jester to be sort of cool looking, but unfortunately, a lot of the cards' characters were just so drowned in darkness that you couldn't even take time to really appreciate their design. So even that aspect of the movie that I thought could be promising turned out to be super underwhelming and silly. I found in particular Harriet Slater as our main character to just not be super likable at all. She wasn't super intriguing. I think the only ones that really worked for me were Avantika and Jacob Batalon, and they're actors that are already sort of established in other movies, so maybe that's why I liked them here, but they also were the only ones that genuinely brought, I think, any real level of charisma to their performances. To be fair to the other actors, this movie was very poorly written, so they couldn't really do much to bring their characters much charisma because they were cliched sort of slates. We had the actress who I think was also in that recent horrible remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and she's playing another sort of cliched character here who is just trying to help out the characters with their problem, and it's just a character you've seen so many times, and it's amazing how she does not seem to be that knowledgeable at all at the end of the day. And yeah, you have all the cliched horror moments of, you know, characters hearing something and then walking that way and then there's nothing there. Or characters going up where they shouldn't and then, lo and behold, something happens to them and they get killed. It's all the same rhyme and verse that you've heard time and time again. So yeah, I had some hopes that the movie could be at least somewhat fun, but it was very far from that. It was actually sort of a torturous watch in some ways. Maybe not the worst horror movie ever, but definitely not one that I would ever recommend. 1.5 out of 5 stars for this one. And finally, let's end off with talking about the movie Civil War, directed by Alex Garland. I was hoping that this movie would be sort of a return to form for Alex Garland after Men that was very underwhelming and felt like it was trying to be more artsy than was good for it, and I found to be more pretentious than anything else. And thankfully, we did get a better movie from him, a much better one, I would say. The movie doesn't really talk about the Central War in the film at all, even though I think that would be a very prescient political issue, considering the landscape we're in right now. But I also sort of understand why Alex Garland would want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, because it would be divisive no matter which way you pushed it forward. So I guess it was more fitting to talk about something more universal, but I do still wish we had gotten maybe a little bit of commentary about what was going on in the war, because we don't really understand at all what the people are fighting for. And yeah, I would still say the central commentary is pretty interesting. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say it's toothless, as some people have said it is. I think there is still something interesting to be said here about how we seem to enjoy, quote-unquote, enjoy looking at disasters more than we do other things, or more than we do about caring about them. We just care about the aesthetic of seeing them sometimes, and I think that is a very individualist American mindset, so it was interesting to see the movie pursue that forward. And I think especially interesting to see that character development happening through Kaylee Spaney's character, Jessie. She's the one who has more of the arc in here, and it's pretty foreboding to see where her character goes, but I think very fitting given the movie's themes. That's not to say that Kirsten Dunst's character isn't great either, because she has a very interesting arc herself. Hers is, interestingly, sort of the opposite of Kaylee Spaney's character, and I sort of appreciate the two different arcs that they go on. And then the more wizened journalist in Stephen Henderson as Sammy, I really liked what he brought to the table as well. And Wagner Moura was great here as Joel. I found his character to be fascinating, especially where they ended his character was super interesting to me. There are a lot of cool scenes in this movie that I think continue to enforce its theme really well, and I like how contemplative the movie gets at many times. I like that the characters get a lot of chances to just sort of talk and build their relationships with one another, which makes me feel that all these characters feel like really full people. I feel like I know them very well. But this movie isn't without its foreboding or tense moments. In fact, there are places where it feels like a straight-up horror movie, which is something Alex Garland does well. There's a scene in particular with Jesse Plemons that is just white-knuckled tense that really had me on the edge of my seat. And then the ending of this movie is really powerful and well done, and I think ends the movie out on a pretty impactful note. So yeah, I did enjoy this overall. Like some of the movies I've talked about on here, I think this one maybe ran a little bit too long, and I do also think that I still have a problem with the fact that we don't really know anything at all about the war. For a movie called Civil War, we don't know anything about it, which just is a little perplexing to me. I also would have liked to have gotten to know the president a little better, because that's who the newscasters are getting ready to interview, and there's a lot of resentment towards him, but we don't ever know why. And I would have liked to know a little bit about that. But nevertheless, I did still enjoy this movie a pretty fair amount and thought it was really well done. 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that ends this episode of short movie reviews. So what were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting, then please leave a like and subscribe to my channel to see more videos like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.